They were arrested at 6 a.m. in a Zurich hotel. The football world stopped. On the morning of May 27, 2015, Swiss police entered the Bauer Olac Hotel in Zurich, one of the most expensive hotels in Europe, and arrested 7 men in their rooms before breakfast. The men were senior officials of FIFA, the organization that governs world football. They were arrested not by Swiss prosecutors acting on their own initiative, but at the request of the United States Department of Justice, which had spent years building a case against a corruption network that had operated inside football's governing body for decades. The charges included wire fraud, racketeering, and money laundering. The total value of bribes documented in the indictment was over $150 million. This is the story of how the world's most popular sport was sold, and by whom. To understand the FIFA corruption scandal, you need to understand what FIFA actually was, not as a sporting body, but as a political and financial institution. The Fédération Internationale de Football Association was founded in Paris in 1904 with 7 member nations and a mission to standardize the rules of association football internationally. By the 21st century, it had 211 member associations, more than the United Nations, and governed the most watched sporting event in human history. The FIFA World Cup final regularly draws audiences of over 1 billion people. The broadcast rights, sponsorship packages, and commercial revenues associated with the tournament are measured in billions of dollars per cycle. This extraordinary financial power was concentrated in an institution whose governance structure was, for most of its modern history, almost entirely unaccountable to any external authority. FIFA was a Swiss non-profit association, governed by a congress of its member associations and administered by an executive committee whose members served long terms and faced no meaningful external oversight. Its financial affairs were not subject to the kind of transparency requirements that applied to public companies or government bodies. Its decision-making processes, including the all-important decisions about which countries would host World Cups, were conducted behind closed doors by a small group of officials who could not be voted out by the public and who faced no regulatory scrutiny from any national government with the practical power to hold them accountable. Sepp Blatter had been FIFA's general secretary since 1981 and became its president in 1998, defeating the Brazilian João Havelange, himself a figure later implicated in corruption, in an election that was itself, according to subsequent investigations, influenced by vote buying. Blatter ran FIFA for the next 17 years as his personal domain. He was a master of football's internal politics, adept at building coalitions among the smaller national associations by delivering development funding and technical assistance, and equally adept at ensuring that those associations' officials understood that their continued access to FIFA's resources depended on their loyalty to him personally. The corruption that characterized FIFA under Blatter was not a spontaneous phenomenon. It was a system developed over decades by officials who had learned that their positions gave them something that commercial entities were willing to pay for: the right to broadcast a World Cup, the right to sponsor a World Cup, the right to host a World Cup. These rights were worth billions to the entities that obtained them. The officials who voted on who obtained them were worth far less than billions, but they could be made to feel otherwise. The bribery network that American prosecutors documented in their 2015 indictment had not been created by Blatter alone. It had been built over decades by a generation of officials who had come to treat their votes as personal financial assets, and it functioned because every party to every transaction understood that FIFA's internal culture made it essentially immune to external accountability. The man who understood this system most intimately, and who eventually became the key to dismantling it, was not a prosecutor or a journalist. He was a very large American with a long white beard who liked to eat well and spend other people's money. His name was Chuck Blazer. Chuck Blazer was the General Secretary of CONCACAF, the Confederation of North, Central America, and Caribbean Association Football, from 1990 to 2011. He was also a member of FIFA's Executive Committee for many years, which gave him a vote on the decisions that mattered most in world football, including World Cup hosting awards. Blazer lived at a level of personal extravagance that bore no relationship to any legitimate salary he could have been earning from his football positions. He maintained apartments in Trump Tower in New York, one for himself, one famously for his cats, and a home in the Bahamas, and traveled the world on football's expense account with a grandeur that other senior officials noted with something between envy and disbelief. What sustained Blazer's lifestyle, investigators discovered, was his systematic extraction of money from the organizations he controlled and from the commercial entities that wanted access to the football rights those organizations controlled. His tenure at CONCACAF was characterized by the diversion of organizational funds for personal use, the acceptance of kickbacks from companies bidding for broadcasting rights, and the solicitation of bribes in connection with World Cup votes. He was, in the language of the eventual indictment, a corrupt official who had treated his position as a commercial opportunity from the first year of his tenure. The mechanics of how FIFA bribes were typically paid evolved over time, but followed consistent patterns that investigators were eventually able to document in detail. A broadcasting company or sports marketing agency, wanting to secure rights to a tournament, would negotiate not only the official commercial terms of the deal, but a separate, unofficial payment to the officials controlling the decision. These payments were routed through shell companies, offshore bank accounts, and wire transfers that were designed to obscure their true nature. Some were described in documentation as consulting fees, marketing commissions, or development contributions, categories that provided a veneer of legitimacy to what were, in reality, straightforward bribes. The bribery around World Cup hosting decisions followed a similar, but even more consequential pattern. When countries bid to host a World Cup, they assembled elaborate technical proposals, stadium plans, transportation infrastructure, accommodation capacity, security arrangements. These proposals were evaluated by FIFA committees and ultimately voted on by the full executive committee. The votes of executive committee members were, the indictment documented, purchasable. The extent of the bribery around specific World Cup hosting decisions, including the awards of the 2018 World Cup to Russia and the 2022 World Cup to Qatar, was alleged in the indictment and in subsequent investigations, though the precise details of which votes were bought and how much they cost remain subjects of ongoing legal dispute and denial by the relevant parties. The key to the entire case, the moment when the U.S. Department of Justice went from having suspicions to building an actual criminal prosecution, was the day that Chuck Blazer became a government informant. In 2011, facing a tax investigation by the IRS for his unreported income from football corruption, Blazer made a decision that would eventually bring down the most powerful figures in world football. He agreed to cooperate. He wore a wire at football events. He provided years of testimony and documentation. And he pleaded guilty, in secret, to 10 counts of racketeering, wire fraud, and tax evasion. Here is what makes this case unlike any other we have covered. The people who finally stopped FIFA were not European regulators. They were not football authorities. They were American federal prosecutors, and their jurisdiction over a Swiss football body required one of the most creative legal arguments in modern criminal law. Stay with me. The legal theory that allowed American prosecutors to bring charges against officials of a Swiss nonprofit organization governing a sport with minimal American participation was both straightforward and audacious. The U.S. Department of Justice's Eastern District of New York argued that because the corrupt payments involved in the FIFA bribery network passed through American banks or were denominated in U.S. dollars, as virtually all major international financial transactions are, the transactions were subject to American wire fraud and money laundering statutes. The use of the U.S. financial system, even briefly, and even for transactions whose primary participants were all foreign nationals operating outside the United States, was sufficient to establish American jurisdiction. This legal theory had been developing in U.S. financial crime prosecution for years and had been used in other international corruption cases. But its application to a sports organization of FIFA's global prominence and political sensitivity was unprecedented, and the decision to pursue it required a sustained commitment from the Eastern District that went back well before the 2015 arrests. Prosecutors had been building the case quietly for years, working with Blazer's cooperation, gathering evidence from financial institutions that had processed the corrupt payments, and developing the human intelligence network that eventually allowed them to identify enough participants to bring the sprawling indictment that was unsealed on May 27, 2015. The operation was coordinated with Swiss authorities, who executed the hotel arrests simultaneously with the American indictment announcement. The 7 officials arrested at the Bauer au Lac were taken to Swiss detention pending extradition proceedings. Among them were senior CONCACAF and CONMEBOL, the South American Confederation, officials who had been at the heart of the bribery network for years. The news, which broke globally within hours of the arrests, created a shock in the football world that those who followed the sport described as unlike anything they had previously experienced. Senior FIFA officials being walked out of a luxury Zurich hotel in handcuffs was simply not something the football world had believed was possible. For days after the arrests, FIFA held its scheduled presidential election. Sepp Blatter, who had not been arrested and was not named in the initial American indictment, won re-election as president, defeating his challenger, the Jordanian Prince Ali bin al-Hussein. His victory was celebrated by the bloc of smaller national associations that he had cultivated over years. FIFA's internal politics, it seemed, were immune even to the arrest of 7 of its senior officials on corruption charges. Blatter appeared before the cameras, gave a short speech, and promised reform. For days after winning re-election, Blatter resigned. He announced his decision on June 2, 2015, in a brief statement in which he said that while he had a mandate from the FIFA Congress, he did not have the support of the entire football world. He made no admission of wrongdoing. Swiss authorities subsequently opened a criminal investigation into Blatter's financial conduct, and FIFA's ethics committee banned him from football for 8 years, a ban later reduced, but still effectively ending his active role in the sport he had dominated for 3 decades. The legal proceedings that followed the May 2015 arrests and indictments played out over years, through multiple waves of additional charges and the gradual extradition or surrender of officials from multiple countries. The Eastern District of New York eventually brought charges against over 40 individuals and entities. Many pleaded guilty. Several were convicted at trial. The sentences imposed ranged from probation to several years in federal prison, with the harshest penalties going to those most deeply involved in the bribery networks over the longest periods. Sepp Blatter himself was never indicted by American prosecutors. Swiss authorities investigated him for years on separate charges relating to a payment he had authorized to UEFA President Michel Platini, a 2 million Swiss franc payment that Swiss prosecutors described as a disloyal payment without a legal basis. Blatter was charged, tried in Switzerland, and in 2022 a Swiss criminal court found him not guilty, ruling that the payment to Platini had a legal basis even if its documentation was inadequate. The man who had run FIFA for 17 years and presided over a corruption culture of historic proportions was acquitted of the charges against him personally and faced no criminal conviction. Michel Platini, the UEFA president who had been considered the leading candidate to succeed Blatter as FIFA president before the scandal, was banned from football by FIFA's ethics committee alongside Blatter in 2015. He was later cleared of some charges by the Court of Arbitration for Sport, but remained barred from holding football administrative positions for several years. His presidential ambitions were permanently ended. Chuck Blazer died in July 2017, before his sentencing, having spent his final years in poor health after his cooperation agreement. He never served prison time. The man, whose extravagant lifestyle and ultimate cooperation had made the entire prosecution possible, died with his legal case still technically unresolved, his guilty plea on record, but his sentence never formally imposed. The structural reforms that FIFA implemented following the scandal were significant, but contested. Gianni Infantino, a Swiss-Italian former UEFA General Secretary, was elected FIFA president in 2016 on a reform platform and introduced governance changes, including term limits, financial disclosure requirements, and an enhanced compliance structure. Critics argued that the reforms, while real, did not fundamentally address the power concentration and accountability deficit that had made the corruption possible in the first place, and that FIFA's structural incentives, the enormous financial flows controlled by a small group of officials accountable primarily to each other, remained largely intact. The 2018 World Cup was held in Russia, and the 2022 World Cup was held in Qatar, as originally awarded. The allegations of bribery surrounding both awarding decisions remained subjects of investigation and denial, but neither hosting decision was reversed. Billions of fans watched both tournaments. The sport continued. The corruption that the world had witnessed, the arrests, the guilty pleas, the trails of offshore payments, was absorbed into football's ongoing narrative without changing its fundamental direction. The world's most popular sport had been sold, and then it had been sold again, and the game went on. Before we finish, drop one word in the comments. Do you think the World Cup hosting decisions for Russia and Qatar should have been reversed after the corruption was exposed? One word, yes or no, because that answer tells you something about how you think accountability should actually work. I read every single one. FIFA was a kingdom that ran on loyalty and cash. The next case we're covering ran on the same thing, inside a company that millions of people trusted with their money every day. Subscribe.